Welcome back, Soren.
Yes, back in the studio.
Back in the studio. This has been really amazing experience for me, hanging out with you like this.
I think that it's been like so rewarding for me because I love to talk. I love to chat about everything. And I don't really have a fantastic outlet for some of these deeper subjects. So I think that this is a really like cathartic experience for the both
that's
of
a great word for it.
Yeah.
So last week we were talking about queer media. And when we were wrapping up the conversation, you made a statement about you and maybe some of your friends feeling like this idea of queer representation in the media is just the way it is now. Like just, you don't have as strong of a feeling about it that I have, having missed that representation in my childhood and formative years. For you and your peer group, this is just the way it is. And so these queer identities are just woven into these storylines and you don't even blink an eye. And it got me thinking about the topic we wanted to bring up today, which is around stigma and mental health. And when we were prepping for this conversation, you made a comment that was also really interesting to me. And it reminded me of what we talked about last week, where you said, for you and your folks your age, you don't necessarily feel like there is a negative stigma or as much of a negative stigma around mental health, because for you and your peer group, this is just a thing.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, obviously people like frown upon the negative behaviors which mental illness evokes, but like the discussion of it is so normalized. Like I, in my peer group at least, open, honest conversations about our mental health and our mental health journey is such a normal and common occurrence.
Yeah.
And I think we like have no like, I guess, what's the word I'm trying to come up with? Reticence?
Maybe.
We don't feel like cautious around the subject.
Yeah.
We approach it bluntly, I would say. And it's not seen as something that you have to like tiptoe around or try to like augment the way that you're speaking. Like it's very normalized.
So for you and your friends, it's not abnormal to both say, how you doing? I'm noticing you're a little down or you haven't been quite yourself lately. Or to say, you know what? I'm not feeling great.
Yeah.
That's a very normal conversation to have.
I would say like maybe this is unique to my friend group, but I feel like it's fairly pervasive. Like discussions of like mental health and general like standing emotionally is so normal and common.
Yeah.
Like, and my friend group, a lot of us have had like fairly extreme histories with mental illness. And I think the way that we approach it is so different to the way that it used to be approached.
Yeah.
And maybe you could share a little bit about like your, I guess, understanding about mental health and what mental illness was in your youth.
Yeah.
Right?
The exact opposite of how you're describing it, if I can be very blunt. I don't have any memory of ever saying to one of my childhood, when I say childhood, I'm thinking like school age, kindergarten through high school. I can't think of one time where I have said, I'm feeling really down or depressed or, maybe I think stressed is probably the word that my generation used most to reflect anything not baseline. Stressed.
Yeah.
And stressed might mean I'm anxious. Stressed might mean I'm down. Stressed might mean I'm frustrated or angry. But that was just sort of like, I'm stressed. Nor do I remember, despite what I do for a living, I don't remember ever checking in with other friends to say, this is out of character for you. How are you? What's going on in your life?
Well, like, I think the reason it's been so normalized in my age group is just the raw prevalence of like extreme emotional experiences
Mm.
that we've all had. Like there is a mental health crisis in our youth.
Right.
And as a result of that, we can have like far more open and honest dialogues because like the vast majority of us have, at least to some extent, dealt with similar issues.
Yeah. So it's so normalized.
Yeah.
And as a behavioral health provider and somebody who speaks on these topics often, I know that this behavioral crisis is unlike anything we've seen, both here in our state of Maine, but also across our country. Wait lists, demand for services, and workforce shortages are just like we're in the eye, maybe we're approaching the eye of this perfect storm. That as a provider terrifies me. Yet when I talk to you about your perception of a lack of stigma, it actually gives me a little bit of hope, because in my world, stigma is one of the barriers to being able to talk openly about wellness. Stigma, whether we're afraid to appear weak, whether we're afraid to be acting in a way that doesn't fit with our gender role or our assigned gender role, like as growing up male, boys don't talk about feelings.
Yeah.
And as we've talked about in a previous podcast, I was so deeply in the closet that I never would consider doing anything that publicly or interpersonally threw my gender role into question.
Yeah.
So being stoic, even though I felt things very deeply, very deeply, I wouldn't ever do anything to be able to say, I'm not well, I'm not doing okay.
Yeah.
I worry would have put a bigger target on my back. Now, whether it would have in real life or not, I'm not sure, but that's what it felt like. And that is a part of what stigma looks like.
Yeah.
To me.
Well, I do see that like male stoicism in a lot of my friends, because I do have several like male friends, cisgender male friends that do identify with that gender role strongly and identify with being stoic, but yet at the same time, they're struggling with like deep emotional crises. And I think I've intentionally spent a lot of time attempting to like break down the idea of stoicism and try to have like blunt conversations, which like, I don't know if it's me introducing the topic or them genuinely desiring to have like real conversations.
Maybe both.
Yeah. I feel like stoicism serves as such like a barrier to attempting to actually be productive mentally.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Absolute block for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, when I feel like professionally, I see stigma being such a hurdle for folks my age and maybe the in-between generations from you and I, like, so folks who are currently in their early or mid 20s, who are maybe experiencing things like parenthood or life after college or life after grad school or life after trade school, where pressure is also quite high, just in a very different way.
Yeah.
And I think here's a wonder I have, and let me know if this jives for folks in your age bracket. The experience of the pandemic, where there was a concerted effort to get this PSA type message out there of check in with your friends. When we were in full lockdown mode, where social interaction was essentially cut off, as a behavioral health provider, I know that what I both preached and practiced was check in, make it weird, ask folks, especially your male friends, ask them how they're doing, and portray yourself as being somebody who is safe and non-judgmental, to acknowledge I'm not well. Because to your point, what we knew through the pandemic was the vast majority of us at one time or another were not well during that period of time.
Well, okay. I don't think that necessarily like the PSA during the pandemic, go check in with your friends, resulted in this. However, I think the pandemic super indirectly impacted that. Like during the pandemic, a lot of my friends, and myself included, were extremely emotionally isolated. And that created extreme negative emotional experiences for us. And like with a lot of my friends, it was like life or death situation, the pandemic.
Yeah, quite literally.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
For me, definitely.
Yeah.
So now coming off of that, we have learned the necessity of communication rather than learning that by being told to do so. We, through our experience, now understand the gravity of the situation and understand that we need to be a support system for each other, right?
So let me ask you this. Was this idea of being more open about your wellness or your absence of wellness for you and your friends, did that exist prior to March of 2020? Or did the experience of March 2020 help move you and your peer group into this enhanced comfort of just acknowledging, validating, and talking through tough times?
Well, okay. I think that my mother and my father have ingrained in me really healthy, like emotional and interpersonal habits with communication about emotions. And I think like those skills that they've given me have been so beneficial. So I did have an idea of that. And I understood to some extent the importance of communication about emotion before that time. Yeah. However, like it wasn't really seen as like a necessity before then. And I don't think I had like the depth of relationships in March of 2020 that I do right now, nor do I have any of the same friends, right? Like in March of 2020, I was still a small child. I was, I think, 12.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So like it wasn't, I didn't have the depth of emotion that I have now. Yeah. And I was a scared little child.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do think that like communication about emotions has been something that's been emphasized throughout my entire youth. But I don't think that that's the case for really any of my friends, actually.
Yeah. And I think about some of the young people that I know and work, know interpersonally and know professionally. I would suggest that maybe for you and your peer group, you have normalized this checking in, perhaps to a higher degree than what other similar age kids are doing. And I also wonder, because you have shared parts of your own journey with mental illness, and some of the situations that you and friends have been in, so that the commonality of some of your lived experiences with mental health and wellness maybe has opened up the door to be more vulnerable and transparent.
Yeah.
I still know a significant number of young people, especially young boys, young males, who would rather step on a nail than say, I'm struggling right now.
Well, that's such a conflict that like so many people face. Like it's very difficult. Like, and a lot of my friends feel guilty when they're talking about like issues that they're having because I think that they're saddling someone else with their burden.
They feel like
they feel guilty for putting their emotions onto someone else because they feel like they're like creating a negative experience for others around them rather than attempting to like lower their burden.
But is the communication so open that as the receiver of their struggle, you are, I'm imagining there's a pathway to saying, you know what, I don't know that I'm in a space to hear or adequately support you with what you're going through right now.
Yeah.
And kind of put up that no trauma dumping allowed right now.
I don't think that that's been, at least in my group, I think that we're all very able to some extent.
To have those boundaries.
To have those boundaries just naturally.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't have to be something that's set forth. We can all just like vibe out the comfortability level of others. And you, I think, can through like understanding the conversation and how it's flowing and knowing
Yeah.
your peers, make those boundaries sort of non-verbally.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we do.
Yeah.
But I know myself, whenever I get like someone shares an emotional experience with me, I feel relieved. I don't feel emotionally burdened by what they have to say, because I feel like, A, I'm helping someone, and that makes me feel fantastic.
Yeah.
Like, I think it actually fills my bucket,
Yeah.
because I am super interested in what my friends have going on. I would love to hear their life experience. And by listening to that, I feel like I've helped them. And then I leave feeling fulfilled, feeling more in the know and not worrying about them.
Yeah.
And I feel like rewarding.
Yeah.
It's a rewarding experience for me.
Yeah. And you are such an empathic person as well.
I try to be.
You are. You absolutely are. You know, it's interesting. Like last week, we were talking about queer media and my experience growing up in the absence of healthy, inclusive role models or representation in the media. I feel like mental health for me is the same way. You know, like the stigma or the stereotype of mental illness back in my childhood looked like the homeless person talking to themselves on the streets. It looked like a more violent, not what's the word I'm looking for?
Uncontrollable.
Yeah.
Like sort of unpredictable.
Unpredictable. Like they could snap at any minute. And therefore acknowledging these universal emotions of depression, sadness, you know, all the shades of depression, all the shades of the anxiety colors might mean that people are going to see me like that. So I better not talk about it.
Well, I think up until very recently, you mentioned this vision of mental illness as like in very extreme situations with like homeless people, right? That was the only mental illness that was made visible because people were so afraid to share their experiences, right? So then that was the only thing that we saw of mental illness. So then when someone else attempted to come forward about their experience, we would associate them with that.
That's right.
So, and then more people would be like, oh, now I can't share my experience.
Right.
And I think it's a super recent phenomenon that we're seeing mental illness not as something to be feared or like necessarily an objective negative, but rather a universal experience that one can grow from, that can be positive in the long run, and that needs to be addressed in a like, not professional, but a serious way.
Yeah.
Right. And actually, this is sort of pivoting, but I see like a lot of youth addressing their mental health crises. And I do this myself to cope through like jokes. And it's seen as something very jovial. And I think that is important to some extent. But also I think it can be negative because it doesn't address the gravity of the situation. Yeah. And like in a lot of these situations, it's people's lives in the balance. Yeah. Like it needs to be a serious conversation. Yeah, it can't be like off the cuff.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Yeah. And this idea of stigma, which as you've been talking about is connected to stereotype, which is connected to prejudice, which is connected to unconscious implicit bias, runs so deep as well that for folks with more years on this planet, there's a lot more for us to have to unpack. Let me give you a fairly recent example. So I see myself very humbly as a pretty decent social worker. I think I'm pretty good at what I do.
I think you're fantastic.
Thanks. And let me tell you this story. So several weeks ago, I was in Portland, which is probably Maine's largest city, just a couple hours south of where we are now. And I was meeting friends, and they gave me an address for a parking garage area. And I was going to meet them there. We were going to go to dinner and see a show. So I got there first, and it was an outdoor parking area, very unlike what we have here in our neck of Maine. And so I got there first. And so I parked the car, got out, and paid for the parking. Coming back into my car, I noticed a gentleman kind of emerge from the bushes from around a building. And instantly, I recognized two things. I recognized that this individual looked the part of somebody who's absence of housing.
Yeah.
And either struggling with an acute mental health issue or was under the influence of something.
Yeah.
So as I walked to my car, monitoring where he was the whole time, being the really good social worker that I think I am, what do you think I did the minute I got in my car?
Okay. What I think you did, I think is different from, I think you locked your car and
I absolutely
drove away.
I didn't drive away. I locked my car door and reclined my seat to be under the view. Now, here's what, and I didn't give a second thought of doing that.
Yeah.
It was three things happening almost instantaneously: locking the door, reclining my seat, and pulling up my phone to get either my friends that I was meeting or 911 on speed dial. It wasn't for a couple seconds that my intellectual social worker brain kicked in. And I said to myself, Chris, you know that statistically speaking, homeless individuals are more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. And individuals with mental health issues, behavioral health issues, are more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. Like, I know that the data supports that. Yet this idea of mental illness is dangerous and unpredictable, and I was at risk, was so pervasive for the 50 years I've been on this planet that without even thinking about it, I locked my door, hid from view, and got my phone ready.
Well, we've been trained to see that as like, that is danger. That's not a person. That's like
a threat.
That's a walking threat.
Yep.
Right. And I think actually that ties into like a modern, the man versus the bear. Like, you're so much more likely, assuming it's just like a randomly selected man, to have like a bear mutilate you.
Yeah.
But like, women are trained to be afraid of like liabilities because it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
But also it's dehumanizing to some extent. And it's like not an irrational fear, not an irrational fear, but like a not based in statistics fear.
That's right. It's so ingrained. I mean, I think what you're speaking about is a social media trend going around now on would you rather face a bear in the woods or a man you don't know in the woods? Yeah. And most women, when asked, would choose the bear over the man, because this idea of violence and threat and personal safety, it runs deep. And I don't pretend to know from the perspective of a woman. I don't pretend to know. I mean, my privilege, as you and I often talk about, identifying as a man, being born a man, I don't know what that feels like. Yeah. Yet there I was in that parking lot in Portland, shrinking from view and locking my door when I perceived a threat. But it's the stereotype, the stigma runs so deep. And I loved how you said, we've been trained to believe this. Everything that I grew up with in the media, and even walking around as an adolescent in the streets of my hometown, I was trained to perceive danger in something I didn't understand. Well, like, which is, I think, evolutionarily viable. If you don't know what's happening, leave immediately. Right. And like, my parents have trained me to do that. That's right. In order to avoid risk, don't be around anything that you don't know about. Yeah. Which makes sense, but also can create a ton of problems and like societal rifts. Yeah. And that like fear of the unknown has resulted in the degree of stigma that we have around mental illness. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So I'm curious, Soren, with you and your friends, do you have any, for folks that might be watching or listening who are thinking to themselves, well, this is easier said than done. Like, how am I supposed to even start normalizing talking about health and wellness? Do you have any strategies that have worked really well for your friend groups on how you approach the checking in or the being checked in with?
Yeah. So with a lot of my male friends, I feel like they are only comfortable having like deep conversations like that and addressing that issue in like a very specific context.
Yep.
Like for our friend group, it's around the fire.
Yeah.
Right. You need, which I think men have been doing for
Thousands
decades.
of years.
Thousands of years.
Yeah.
Go to the man cave. That's where you talk about these things.
Yeah.
And I think it's been like a general progression of trying a little, trying to start that dialogue, just naturally in contexts that are very low key, very comfortable. And then eventually you can introduce that topic in, less like tailored situations. And like, you can just check in with people, through texting, or like actually, a really great example that I think, was fantastic was, one of my friend's girlfriend, not one of his girlfriends, my friend's girlfriend, like I think a month ago or so was talking to me and very concerned for my friend. So I just started a random conversation. It wasn't about anything to do with mental illness. And then like, my friend just started talking about how their day was and what they've been doing. And then they talked about like some of the stress with their homework. And then that's like an opportunity to seize on.
Yeah.
You can say, oh, like what has your emotional experience been of late? And then you can share like your experience, which I think like showing vulnerability yourself is so important to attempt to get somebody to open up. It needs to be a mutual dialogue. You're not pulling information out of them. You're sharing information with the group.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think it's our old pal, Mr. Rogers, who talks about how anything mentionable is manageable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the ability to put something in words, as scary as it initially might be, if you can talk about it, you can manage it better. You can deal with it. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is you're building new habits.
Yeah.
Creating new muscles to then hopefully start working out and let muscle memory eventually take over. You're normalizing and you're modeling that I can talk about this stuff with you. I trust you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know you're not judging me. I know that you're not going to break my confidence and tell other people what I've told you. So you're modeling that you are a safe person and you are just creating space to let that person come to you. Like you're opening the door and then walking away from the door and allowing them to walk through when they're ready.
I totally agree. For me, it's just about expanding the safe space.
Right.
Creating a like regular dialogue rather than it being like conversations in isolated events. You need to see emotions and the progression of them holistically.
Yeah.
And you need to address them holistically.
That is so important because if we're only checking in with our loved ones and friends during the difficult times, then we might be sending the unintended message that I only care when you're at your worst.
I think that's really like profound.
And I think also have to normalize, because I have some memories as well where if I was too excited about something, I'm also crossing that gender role that I'm supposed to be stoic. Yeah. And so the extremes on either end of stoicism, if I'm too low or too high, I've veered out of my lane as what the male is supposed to be like.
Well, I am super thankful to the environment that my parents have provided because I am a very expressive, dare I say, extreme person. And when I'm having an emotional experience, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And I am very excitable and vibrant and joyous.
Yeah. And
I think if I was raised in an environment in which the traditional male gender role was emphasized heavily, I would be to some extent broken, right? Because I would be crashing against the walls of a box that I simply can't fit into. Yeah. And I'm like breaking my bones on each hit. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think some
that's a powerful
men
image.
feel like pent up.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a powerful image. Well, and here's what I also want to say is that, you are providing some really valuable insight into how young people can normalize and check in and make this, create safe spaces to talk about this. And it's also important to help coach families
Yeah.
to also create that similar space.
Yeah.
That any emotion my child is experiencing is valid.
Yeah.
It's okay. We can talk about it. And I think so much of our language, whether we're even aware of it or not, calm down. You're too, you're hyper.
Yeah.
You're too, you're a lot right now. Like I think about those kind of comments that I've heard families or parents, caregivers say about kids, like they're a lot.
Yeah.
And I want to be like, what does that mean? Well, they feel everything. And I'm like, great. Like that's a strength. I see that as a powerful strength. I see that as what we know is that a young person's ability to express and identify feeling is linked to resiliency, is linked to good health outcomes. That if I know what it is I'm feeling and I have some insight into what it is and why it is, and I can talk about it, then when times are a little tougher, that skill set can manifest there as well.
It needs to be like a constant dialogue. To destigmatize, you have to normalize.
Yeah. Oh, that's our tagline for this episode. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I'm so excited for the future with looking at the conversations that like I'm seeing happen around me. Obviously, we're all afraid and there is a mental health crisis. But I think it's really important to remember that with each low point, there is an up, right? And through these negative experiences and through this like collective trauma that the mental health crisis is putting our youth through, we can yield emotional maturity. We can yield better coping strategies as a generation. And we can inform like older people to create a more like cohesive social unit that supports each other. Yeah.
Well, what we've talked about in this podcast before is this idea that our best days are still ahead.
Yeah.
That there's always better days ahead, that we are all works in progress. And the other piece that I hear you talking about, which I think is just really kind of magical, is shared experiences build community.
Yeah.
And community builds resiliency.
Yeah.
And so the more we can connect with one another on the shared universal experiences where it's okay to talk about the rough stuff as much as the positive stuff, we can build community. In community, there is strength. And in strength, there's resilience to those challenges the next time they come around.
Yeah. We're all in this together.
Yeah. Well, Soren, this has been another fascinating conversation with you. I'm really excited to see where the second half of our season goes.
Well, I think that this has been fantabulous. Episode 6 out?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think episode 6. So as we launch into the second half of season 1 of the Inspired Insights podcast, we want to thank you so much for sticking with us and listening to us. I'm Chris McClellan.
I'm Soren Peterson.
We'll see you next time.
Have a marvelous day.
The Inspired Insights podcast has been brought to you by Inspired Consulting Group, LLC.
Edited and produced by Amanda Seidel.
Music by Derek Herder. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved.